From Ionia, the Persian fleet set sail for the Hellespont and conquered all the cities on its left side as it entered the strait. The cities on the right side had already been conquered by the Persians from land. On the European shore of the Hellespont were the following localities: Chersonesus with a number of cities, then Perinthus, fortresses in Thrace, then Selymbria and Byzantium. The inhabitants of Byzantium and those living on the opposite shore, the Chalcedonians, did not wait for the Persian attack. They left their cities and sailed to the Euxine Sea. There they settled in the city of Mesembria, today's Nesibar. The Persians, having burned these cities, returned to Chersonesus to conquer the remaining cities, which they had failed to destroy during their first landing. They did not attack Kizik because, as soon as they appeared, the inhabitants submitted to the king. Miltiades, son of Cimon, who had recently returned to Chersonesos, now faced an even greater misfortune than before. 3 years earlier, he had been driven out by the Scythians. The Scythian nomadic tribes, angered by Darius' attack, united and invaded Chersonesos. Miltiades did not wait for the Scythians to attack, but fled into exile until the Scythians left and the Dolongians brought him back. These events took place 3 years before the next misfortune befell him. During the night, Mardonius' camp in Macedonia was attacked by the Thracians of the Brig tribe. Many Persians were killed, and Mardonius himself was wounded. Incidentally, not all of the Brig tribe escaped Persian slavery. Mardonius withdrew from this country only after subjugating its inhabitants. He was then forced to retreat with his army because his land forces suffered heavy losses from the Brygians, and his fleet suffered a terrible disaster at Athos. Thus, this campaign ended in disgrace, and the army returned to Asia. Just 2 years later, Darius first sent a messenger to the Thracians to destroy the city walls and send their ships to Abdera. After the siege of the city by Histiaeus of Miletus, the Thracians, with their enormous revenues, spent a lot of money on the construction of warships and the erection of powerful fortress walls. They received their revenues from the mines and colonies on the mainland. The gold mines in Scapathessal brought them 80 talents, the mines on Thasos itself a little less, but altogether they were so much that the Thracians were not only free from bread tax, but altogether the income from their mainland possessions and mines brought them an annual sum of 200 talents, and in good years even 300 talents. I myself have seen these mines. Undoubtedly, the most significant of them are the mines discovered by the Phoenicians when they settled on this island under the leadership of Thasos, which is still named after Thasos, the son of Phoenicus. These Phoenician mines on Thasos lie between the localities of Eniron and Kinion, opposite Samothrace. There, an entire mountain has been dug up in search of gold. Such are these mines. The Alcmenoids, being an Athenian clan, were expelled by the Pisistratids because of their attempt, together with other exiles, to liberate Athens by force, but after they were defeated, they built a fortress in Lipsudrian, north of Paeonia. From there, the Alcmenoids organized all kinds of conspiracies against the Pisistratids. Thus, they received a paid commission from the Amphictyony to build the current temple in Delphi, which had not yet been built at that time. They were well off and had worthy people, so they built a temple that was more beautiful than planned. Instead of volcanic rock, they built the facade of the temple from Parian marble. Miltiades' friend spoke in his defense. They spoke in detail about the Battle of Marathon and the capture of Lemnos. He captured Lemnos, avenging the Pelasgians and handing it over to the Athenians. Miltiades, the son of Simon, captured Lemnos as follows: the Pelasgians were driven out of Attica by the Athenians, whether justly or unjustly, I cannot say, but that is what is said. Hecataeus, the son of Hegesander, claims in his opinion that it was unjust. After they appeared in the lands of the Athenians, the Pelasgians were given land to settle at the foot of Hymettus, as a reward for having once built the walls around the Acropolis. When the Athenians saw that this once poor and worthless land was now well cultivated, they were overcome with envy and dreamed of conquering it again. Thus, without causing any harm to the Athenians, the Pelasgians were driven out. The Athenians claimed that they had expelled them fairly, because the Pelasgians living under Himit had boldly insulted them. The daughters and boys of the Athenians constantly went down to the Eniacronos spring for water. At that time, none of the Hellenes had slaves in their homes. When they came for water, the Pelasgians taunted them sarcastically. But that was not all. They were caught red-handed in crimes. And so the expelled Pelasgians moved to other places, including Lemnos. This is what Hecataeus and the Athenians said. The Pelasgians living on Lemnos at that time wanted to take revenge on the Athenians. They knew well when the Athenian festivals were held, and having built small ships with 50 oars each, they ambushed the Athenian women at the festival of Artemis in Broran. There they kidnapped many women, took them to Lemnos, and made them their concubines. When many children were born to these women, they taught them the Athenian language and customs. Their children did not want to associate with the children of the Pelasgian women. If a Pelasgian child hit one of them, all the others would rush to his aid and fight together. They even thought they had the right to rule over the Pelasgians and were stronger. When they learned of this, the Pelasgians called a council. At the council, they shared their concerns about what would happen when these boys grew up, since they were already defending each other against the children of legitimate women and even demanding obedience. Therefore, the Pelasgians decided to kill the sons of the Athenian women. They did so, and along with the children, they killed their mothers. Because of these deeds and previous ones, committed mainly by women who killed their husbands, companions of Tonte, all such terrible deeds in all of Hellas are called Lemnosian. After the Pelasgians killed these children and women, both their land and their women became barren compared to before. Stricken by famine and childlessness, they finally decided to send an embassy to Delphi and ask for deliverance from these misfortunes. Pythia advised them to give satisfaction to the Athenians, whatever the Athenians decided was just. Then the Pelasgians went to Athens and announced their decision to satisfy the Athenians for the injustices they had caused. The Athenians placed their most beautiful bed in the Prytaneum and set a table laden with the most delicious dishes in front of it. Then they told the Pelasgians that they wanted their land in such a rich state. The Pelasgians jumped up and replied, "When a ship sails from your land to ours in a single day with a north wind, then we will give it to you." They knew this was impossible because Athens lay much further south than Lemnos. After the conquest of Egypt, Xerxes needed 4 whole years to supply and gather his army. At the end of the 5th year of Xerxes' reign, for 81 BC, the king set out on a campaign with huge hordes. This was undoubtedly the largest known army. Neither Darius' army in its campaign against the Scythians nor the Scythian army, which followed the Cimmerians, entered Media, conquered almost all of Asia Minor, and settled there, could compare to this army. Subsequently, Darius undertook a campaign to take revenge on the Scythians. According to legend, this was exactly the same as the army of the Atreides in their campaign against Ilion and the Mysians and Tevkris before the Trojan War, who crossed into Europe via the Bosporus, conquered all the Thracians, descended to the Ionian Sea and south to the Peneus River. Dorisk is a vast plain on the Thracian coast. The great river Hebrus flows through it. In ancient times, a royal fortress called Dorisk was built there. During his campaign against the Scythians, Darius left a guard there. Xerxes found this location suitable for reviewing and counting his troops, which he did. Xerxes ordered the admirals to transfer all the ships that had arrived in Dorisk to a port on the coast adjacent to Dorisk, where the Thracian cities of Salar and Zona are located, and at the very end of which is the famous Cape Syrian. This area has belonged to the Cicones since ancient times. The admirals brought their ships to these shores for mooring and then pulled them ashore to dry. At the same time, Xerxes conducted a census of his troops in Doriscus. I cannot say exactly how large the army of each nation was, because no one reports this. The total number of land troops was 1,700,000 men. The census was conducted as follows: 10,000 men were gathered in one place and, after being tightly packed together, a line was drawn around them. Then they let these people go, and along the line they built a wooden fence, as high as a person's navel. Then they gathered another 10,000 soldiers in that place and counted them all in the same way. Finally, the warriors divided them into tribes. The following peoples took part in the campaign. First, the Persians, who were dressed and armed as follows. On their heads they wore so-called tiaras, soft caps made of felt, and on their bodies colorful tunics with iron sleeves, similar to a fish's body. They wore trousers on their feet. Instead of the Hellenic type of shields, they had woven shields, under which quivers hung. They also carried short spears, large bows with reed arrows, and a dagger hung from their right hip on their belt. Their commander was Otan, the father of Xerxes' wife, Amestris. In ancient times, the Greeks called the Persians Kephani, and they called themselves Artes, as their neighbors did. The Medes carried the same weapons as the Persians on their campaign. In fact, these weapons were originally Median, not Persian. Their commander was Tigranes of the Achaemenid dynasty. In ancient times, they were all called Barians. After the arrival of the Colchian media from Athens among these Aryans, they also changed their name. Such is the Median legend. The Kizians went on campaign in Persian armor, only instead of the felt hats, they wore mitres, bands across the forehead. At the head of the Kizians stood Anaph, son of Otan. The Hyrcanians were also armed according to the correspondence. Their commander was Megapan, later governor of Babylon. The Bactrians wore hats very similar to the Median ones, Bactrian reed bows, and short spears. The Scythians, a Scythian tribe, wore pointed turbans on their heads, so thick that they stood upright. They wore trousers and were armed with Scythian bows and daggers. They also had sagaries, double-edged battle axes. This Scythian tribe was called the Amygrian Scythians. The Persians called all Scythians Scythians. The Bactrians and Scythians were led by Histap, son of Darius, and Atossa, daughter of Cyrus. The Aryans were armed with Median bows, and the rest of their weapons were Bactrian. The Aryans were led by Sisam, son of Hydaun. The Parthians, the Harasmians, the Gandharas, and the Dadicas set out on the campaign with Bactrian weapons. Their leaders were Artabazus, son of Pharnaces, for the Parthians, and the Harasmians, Arzan, son of Artias, for the Sogdians, and Artiphius, son of Artabanus, for the Gandharas and the Dadicas. The Caspian people were dressed in goatskins and armed with their local bows made of reeds and Persian swords. Their leader was Ariamad, brother of Artiphius. The Sorangi were dressed in colorful clothes and knee-high shoes. Their bows and spears were Median. They were led by Ferendat, son of Megabaz. The Pacti wore goatskins and were armed with local bows and daggers. Their commander was Artaint, son of Itamatri. The Phrygians' weapons were pretty much the same as the Paphlagonians, with a few minor differences. According to the Macedonians, while the Phrygians lived with them in Europe, they were called Brygians. After moving to Asia, they changed their name to Phrygians along with their place of residence. The Armenians, who had migrated from Phrygian lands, had Phrygian weapons. Their commander was Artok, who was married to the daughter of Darius. The Lydians' weapons were like those of the Greeks. In ancient times, the Lydians were called Myonians, and they got their current name from Lyd, son of Aetus. The Mysians wore local helmets on their heads, and their weapons consisted of small shields and short spears with fire-burned blades. The Mysians were immigrants from Lydia, and according to the name of Mount Olympus, they were called Olympians. The commander of the Lydians and Mysians was Artaphernes, son of Artaphernes, who, together with Datis, attacked at Marathon. The Thracians on the campaign wore fox hats on their heads. They wore tunics on their bodies and colorful cloaks over them. They had strapped sandals on their feet up to their knees. They were armed with short spears, slings, and small daggers. After their migration to Asia, this tribe was named the Vitini, but before that, according to them, they were called the Strymonians, as they lived near Strymon. As they say, the Tevkri and the Mysians drove them from their native lands. The leader of the Asian Thracians was Basic, son of Artaban. At the head of the detachment of 10,000 selected Persian warriors was Hydaun, son of Hydaun. This Persian detachment was called immortal for the following reason: if one of them was killed or maimed, he was removed from the number and another was appointed in his place, so that there were always 10,000 warriors in the detachment, neither more nor less. Of all the nations, the Persians kept the best battle order, and they were also the most valiant. Their equipment was, as I have already said, and in addition, it sparkled with many golden decorations. They were accompanied by carts with concubines and servants in rich clothing. Separate from the soldiers, they also carried provisions on camels with pack animals. Among them was a tribe of horsemen, the Sagartians. They were of Persian origin and language, and their clothing was half Persian and half Pactian. They numbered 8,000 horsemen and, according to their custom, had no copper or iron weapons except daggers. Instead, they had lassos woven from straps. They went into battle with them. They fought as follows: when they approached the enemy, they threw the lasso with a noose and then pulled toward themselves whatever they caught, whether a man or a horse. The people caught with the lasso perished. In battle, the Sagartians stand around the Persians. 109. After crossing the dry bed of the river Lisus, Xerxes passed through the Hellenic cities of Maronea, Dichaea, and Abdera. He then passed by the famous lakes near these cities, such as Ismarida between Maronea and Strymon, and Bistonida, near Dichaea, where the two rivers Travos and Compsantos flow into the sea. At Abdera, Xerxes did not pass by any known lake, but he crossed the Nestos River, which flows into the sea. Then the king passed by the cities lying inland, one of which is located on a lake about 30 stadia in circumference, rich in fish and very salty. The lake was drained when only the draft animals drank its water. The city there is called Pistir. Xerxes left all these Hellenic cities on his left side along the sea. The Thracian peoples through whose lands the king passed were the following: the Petii, the Siconii, the Bistoni, the Sapaei, the Dircii, the Edoni, and the Satri. Those of them who lived by the sea followed the army on ships. All the other tribes mentioned, living inland, except for the Satri, were obliged to participate in the land army. As far as we know, the Satri were never conquered by anyone. They were the only Thracians to preserve their freedom until modern times. They lived high in the mountains, covered with diverse forests and snow, and were known for their extreme belligerence. The famous oracle of Diodorus is located in their domain. This oracle is located highest in the mountains, and the Bessi, one of the tribes of the Satri, perform the interpretations in the temple. The predictions are uttered by the chief priestess, similar to Delphi, and are no different. Here he, Xerxes, passed by the cities, with Pangaeus on his right, a large and high mountain with gold and silver mines. Here live the Pierians, the Odomantes, and of course the Satri. Having performed these and many other magical rites in honor of this river, the Persians crossed a bridge over the Enia River in the region of Eden, where a bridge had already been built over the Struma. Upon learning that this place was called Enia, they sacrificed so many boys and girls from the local population, burying them alive in the ground. Burying victims alive is a Persian custom. As I understood from the stories, the wife of Xerxes Amestris, having reached a ripe old age, ordered the burial of 14 sons of noble Persians in gratitude to the god who, as they say, lived underground. The road passed through Paeonia and Crestonia to the river Hydia. This river originates in Crestonia, flows through Mygdonia, and empties into the marsh of the Axius River. When the army passed through these places, the camels loaded with provisions were attacked by lions. At night, the lions came out of their dens. They did not touch the draft animals or the people, but attacked only the camels. I am amazed at what reason caused the lions to leave the other animals alone and attack only the camels, apparently because the lions had never seen these animals before and were unfamiliar with their meat. Many lions and wild bulls live in these places, whose huge horns are exported by merchants to Hellas. The Nestos River, which flows through the region of Abdera and Achelous, crossing Acarnania, serves as the border for the lion's habitat. East of Nestos, throughout the entire front part of Europe, you will not see a lion, nor west of Achelous, on the rest of the mainland. Lions are found only between these two rivers. 7 different tribes live in the Peloponnese. Of these, the Arcadians and the Silurians, the original inhabitants of the country, still inhabit the places where they lived in ancient times. The tribe of the Achaeans did not actually emigrate from the Peloponnese, but was forced to leave its homeland and now lives in a foreign land. The remaining 4 tribes of the 7 are newcomers. These are the Dorians, the Aetolians, the Dryopes, and the Lemnians. The Dorians have many famous cities, while the Aetolians have only one, Elis. The Dryopes own Hermion and Asine, which is located near Laconia's Cardamil. The Silurians are indigenous inhabitants and seem to be the only Ionian tribe in the Peloponnese. Over time, under the rule of the Argives, they merged with the Dorians. Their neighbors were the Ornians. Of these 7 tribes, the other cities just mentioned remained neutral. To be honest, the other cities sided with the common cause only because they sympathized with the Persians. The sick had to be left behind, and food and retreat were ordered for them from the cities through which the king had already passed through. Some had to be left behind in Thessaly, others in Syr, Paeonia, and Macedonia. There, Xerxes left the sacred chariot of Zeus when he went on a campaign to Hellas. When he set out, he did not take the chariot with him because the Paeonians had betrayed it to the Thracians. When Xerxes asked for his chariot back, the Paeonians replied that the Thracians who lived north of the sources of the Strymon had stolen the mare grazing in the meadow and the chariot. There, the Thracian king of the Bisalts from the land of Creston did something terrible. He announced that he would not voluntarily become a slave to Xerxes and fled to the peaks of the Rhodope Mountains, forbidding his sons from going on the campaign against Hellas. But they disregarded their father's prohibition, or perhaps they were eager to see the war, and joined the king's campaign. When all 6 of them returned unharmed, their father ordered them to be blinded as punishment. The forefather of this Alexander, 7 generations back, was Perdiccas, who conquered the throne of Macedonia in the following manner. 3 brothers, descendants of Temen, fled from Argos to Illyria: Gavin, Aerops, and Perdiccas. From Illyria, after crossing the mountains, the brothers arrived in Upper Macedonia, in the city of Libya. There they entered the king's paid service. The eldest took care of the horses, the second grazed the cows, and the youngest, Perdiccas, took care of the small animals. The king's wife cooked for them herself, for in those ancient times, queens, not just ordinary people, lived in poverty. Every time the queen baked bread for the boy, Perdiccas, the watchman, the dough yielded twice as much bread as usual. As this strange phenomenon repeated itself constantly, the queen finally told her husband about it. And he, having listened to his wife, immediately thought that this was a divine sign and foreshadowed something great. Then the king summoned the watchmen and ordered them to leave the country. And they replied that they first wanted to receive their wages and then they would leave. When he heard about payment, the king, in his divine blindness, exclaimed, "Here is your well-deserved reward." With that, he pointed to the sun, whose rays were shining into the house through the chimney and the roof. Gavin and Aerop, the older brothers, were stunned when they heard the king's words. And the boy said, "Daru, we accept your gift," and traced the sunspot on the floor of the house with the knife he carried with him. Then he traced 3 times the size of the sunspot from the outlined circle on his chest and left with his brothers. So the watchman left, and one of the advisors explained to the king what the boy's action meant and what he had thought when he accepted the gift. Then the king became angry and sent horsemen to catch up with the brothers and kill them. In this country there is a river where the descendants of these brothers from Argos still make sacrifices to their savior. After the Temenians crossed this river, it flooded so much that the horsemen could not cross it. The brothers went to another part of Macedonia and settled near the so-called gardens of Midas, son of Gordius. In these gardens, wild roses with 60 petals grow. Their fragrance is significantly stronger than that of ordinary roses. According to Macedonian legend, Silenus was captured in these gardens. Behind them rises Mount Bermia, whose summit is inaccessible due to snow and cold. The brothers conquered this area, and from here they conquered the rest of Macedonia. Alexander was descended from this Perdiccas. Here are his ancestors. Alexander was the son of Amint, Amint was the son of Alkit, Alkit's father was Aerops, son of Philip. Philip's father was Argius, grandson of Pales, who conquered the Macedonian throne. Such is the genealogy of Amyntas, son of Amyntas. Oyobas, having fled to Thrace, was captured by the Thracians and, according to their custom, sacrificed to the local god Pleister, while his companions were killed in another way. 2-4, Diodorus of Sicily. Diodorus of Sicily was an ancient Greek historian, born in Sicily, who lived approximately between 90 and 30 BC. He devoted 30 years of his life to compiling his historical library, undertaking a series of journeys throughout the world of his time to gather personal impressions and historical books from his predecessors. His work was divided into 40 books. He drew information from Hecataeus of Miletus, Herodotus, Ephorus, Theopompus, and Polybius, sometimes with verbatim quotations, which is why he is also considered a compiler. At the same time, he is the only source for certain historical periods. In summary, it can be said that Diodorus Siculus occupies a solid place among ancient writers as one of the compilers of the universal history of antiquity. Of interest for the present essay are the books and chapters dealing with places and events in the myths and history of Egypt, Mesopotamia and Scythia, Greece and Europe, the Trojan War, Alexander of Macedon. At the beginning of the historical library, Diodorus indulges in philosophical reflections on human life and the role of history, which still sound very relevant and interesting today. So do not all men, because of the weakness of their nature, live only a small part of all eternity, and all the rest of the time they are dead, and therefore those who have not done any worthy deed during their lives, everything they have as living, dies with them. As for those who by their valor have attained glory, their deeds will also be remembered forever, since they are glorified by the divine words of history. I think it wonderful that prudent men, for the sake of suffering as mortals, should attain immortal glory. He then goes on to describe the structure and chronology of his work himself. I begin the exposition of our history with the myths which were prevalent among the Hellenes and the barbarians, examining the facts of antiquity attested in both as far as possible. Our first 6 books cover events and legends up to the Trojan War. Of these, the first 3 set forth the antiquity of the barbarians, the following are almost entirely devoted to the antiquity of the Hellenes. In the following 11 books we have described the general history of the events which took place during the time from the Trojan War to the death of Alexander. In the following 23 books we have set forth all the remaining events up to the very beginning of the war which broke out between the Romans and the Celts, during which time Gaius Julius Caesar, as commander and deified for his deeds, subdued a large part of the most warlike Celtic tribes and extended the power of Rome to the British Isles. The first events of this war ended in the first year of the 180th Olympiad under the archonship of Herod in Athens. As to the general chronology adopted in this treatise, we have not endeavored to fix accurately the events preceding the Trojan War, for we have no reliable chronological table concerning them, and from the Trojan War, according to Apollodorus of Athens, we fix 80 years to the return of the Heraclides, and from that return to the first Olympiad 328 years elapsed, according to the Lacedaemonian kings. From the first Olympiad to the beginning of the Celtic Wars with which we end our history 730 years have passed. So our composition, consisting of 40 books, covers a period of 1,138 years, excluding the events preceding the Trojan War. According to the thesis here, as well as according to the data of the Bulgarian chronicles, the Arias of Idle, Bulgarians, 5 millennia ago conducted a powerful and long-lasting invasion south into Asia, into Fluves, the Middle East, Egypt, Asia Minor, and as a national elite that always builds state among other tribes and peoples, have left a serious mark in the social-economic relations, material and spiritual culture and mythology in these ancient lands, already described in later historical times. Diodorus of Sicily gives accounts of many events, historical and geographical descriptions and comparisons which largely confirm this statement. Inasmuch as the legends report that the gods were born in Egypt, and here the most ancient observations of the stars are said to have been made, and also describe many worthy deeds of great men, we shall begin by presenting the history of the events which took place in Egypt. And so the Egyptians speak that at the very beginning of the appearance of everything, the first men came to Egypt because of the temperate climate of that country and because of the natural features of the Nile. They say that in the deluge of the time of Deucalion, a great part of the people perished, but probably only those living to the south in Egypt escaped, inasmuch as it did not rain in their land. In ancient Egyptian religion, Osiris of the Middle Kingdom era functions as the sun god, and in the New Kingdom he is now simultaneously the sun, the moon, and the constellation Orion. The quality of moon under Isis as the partner of the solar aspect of Osiris is attested as early as the 3rd century BC. The sun god, the Bulgarian Tangra, and in Egypt's supreme god Diodorus had access to sources lost to us, passed down, attributed and written about the Thracian priests and ancient scholars Eumolpus and Orpheus, who because of their indelible fame were centuries later mythologized and used in ancient Greek mythology as well. The Thracians under the name of Tyrians according to the Bulgarian chronicles are one of the ancient Bulgarian tribes who settled in Crete, the country of Mokadan, the Balkan Peninsula, in a narrower sense hence Macedonia, the islands in the Aegean Sea and the straits to the Black Sea. Originally the so-called Bilsaga, Pelasgians and Atriaxids, Trojans and later the Tyrians, Thracians, Dorians, Tyrrhenians. Assuming Diodorus data to be more reliable, this migration came from outside Egypt, and so the people of ancient Egypt, looking up to heaven, were at once astonished and frightened at the nature of the world, and perceived that in the beginning there existed two eternal gods, the sun and the moon, whom they respectively named Osiris, and Isis, each on the ground of a truly intrinsic quality. If the name Osiris were translated into Greek, he would be called a many-eyed, for he scatters rays everywhere, as if he were illuminating all land and sea with countless eyes. In agreement with this is the poet Homer, Aelios, who sees and hears everything. Among the Greeks some old mythographers call Osiris, Dionysus, nicknamed Sirius. Eumolpus, in the Bacchic hymn, says, radiant Dionysus, fiery in rays, and Orpheus says, that is why they call him sanctimonious and Dionysus. Some, on the other hand, suppose that in his case also the knot of the skin of a spotted deer is tied on his shoulder, as is the starry sky. An Isis name is translated into Greek as ancient, because of her recurring birth since antiquity. They disfigure the horned head of Isis, because of her sickle-like resemblance sometimes, and because among the Egyptians a cow is dedicated to her. The Egyptians hold that Isis and Osiris are most influential in the origin of all living things, the one with the natural properties of fire and wind, the other with moisture and drought, and the two together with air. And thanks to this everything is born and nourished. The scheme of the genealogy of the Egyptian pantheon, of the immortal deities and of the mortal heroes have the same analogue as in the Bulgarian annals. This is also seen in the other pantheons of the Near and Middle East, and later in the Greco-Roman pantheon. Besides these gods, according to their words, there were other earthly gods who were once mortal but received immortality through their wisdom and public benefactions to men. Some of them even became kings of Egypt. The Egyptians say that the names of some of them in the Greek translation were the same as those of the celestial gods, while others received names of their own, such as Aelios, Kronos, Rhea, and Zeus, whom they also call Amun. Besides these, there were also Hera, Hephaestus, Hestia, and finally Hermes. The first king of the Egyptians was Aelios, who had the same name as that of the celestial luminary. Some priests report that Hephaestus reigned first, who invented fire and gained power through this useful work. They say that after Hephaestus, Cronus reigned in Egypt. After he married his sister Rhea, to them were born, according to some mythographers, Isis and Osiris, and according to most reports, Zeus and Hera, who reigned over the whole universe thanks to their prowess. From them came 5 gods, one on each day of the Egyptian epigomenon. The gods born had the following names. Osiris translated into Greek means Dionysus. And Isis is in some ways close to Demeter. Osiris married Isis and, taking over the kingdom, did much to improve human social life. Above all, Osiris abolished man-eating among men. Then, when Isis discovered the seeds of wheat and barley growing accidentally on the ground among other grasses and unknown to men, and Osiris taught them to cultivate these seeds, the whole diet was changed by the pleasant properties of these grains, and so gave the people the obvious benefit of refraining from bestiality towards one another. As proof of the discovery of the grain, the Egyptians bring the ancient custom preserved in them. During the harvest, when they cut the first ears, the people next to them stand up and clap their hands and greet Isis. In some towns and temples of Isis the groping ears are brought, as a reminder that they were discovered in ancient times by the skillful goddess, / Osiris was a lover of agriculture, trained in Happy Arabia, at Nisa, near Egypt. And inasmuch as he was the son of Zeus, according to the Greeks, he took his name from the father and place of his birth Dionysos. It is said that around Nisa, he discovered the vine and the grape. When he invented the processing of this fruit, he was the first to use wine and taught other people to process grapes, harvesting, storage and winemaking. He most revered Hermes, generously endowed by nature to invent things that contributed great benefit to people's lives. They say that Osiris, beneficent and ambitious, gathered a great army with the intention of going through the whole world and training mankind to cultivate the grape, to sow wheat and barley. By this means Osiris hoped that, by turning the people from their savagery and changing their daily diet, he would receive immortal honors for his good deeds. Having established his power in Egypt, he handed over to Isis his authority over all, leaving with her as advisor Hermes, distinguished from his other friends by his prudence. He appointed Heracles, who was his kinsman and had amazing courage and a strong body, to be the leader of his state. Osiris appointed Busiris governor of Egypt from Phoenicia and the seacoast, and Antheus governor of the lands from Ethiopia and Libya. Osiris himself with the army went on campaign, taking with him his brother, called by the Hellenes Apollo. They say that he discovered the laurel tree, with which the people wreathed him and depicted the what? They say that with Osiris on the campaign went his 2 sons, Anubis and Magdon, both braves. They used the heaviest weapons against certain animals, with which they were quite equal in courage. Anubis put a dog's head on his head, and Magdon put a wolf's head on his head. Osiris set out on a march through Ethiopia, vowing that he would let his hair grow until he returned to Egypt. Thus was established the custom, observed in Egypt until recently, that all those departing leave their hair until their return. Osiris marched into Ethiopia and then across the Erythraean, Red Sea into Arabia, reached India, and traveled through the Near and Middle East, spreading the knowledge of cultivating the land and the vine among the people everywhere. The tour of Osiris coincides with the data of the Bulgarian annals, where it is claimed that from the deity of the Bulgarians Asa derived the name of Osiris. Isis is a cognate name with him, as are a related pair of deities of the superterrestrial luminaries, the sun and the moon. Osiris also toured other nations in Asia and then passed through Hellespont into Europe. In Thrace, Osiris killed the barbarian king Lycurgus because he resisted his actions. Osiris appointed the now aged Maron to look after the plants in that country and made him the founder of the eponym city, the so-called Maroneia. Osiris made his son Magdon king of the district which was afterwards called after his name Macedonia. If they could not grow vineyards in any of the countries, Osiris taught the people to make beer of barley, which had a similar effect to wine. After traveling all over the world, he returned with honors and glory to Egypt, bringing many gifts, and receiving from all the people unanimous recognition and equal honor in heaven. In consequence of this, Osiris passed from the midst of men into the world of the gods, and Isis and Hermes composed rites and sacrifices to him, and introduced a mystic cult exalting him as a god. The Thracians and Greeks then fully adopted and renamed this cult and its attendant mysteries with orgies in honor of Dionysus. Osiris reigned over Egypt in accordance with the laws until he was murdered by his brother Typhon in conspiracy with many villains. Typhon dismembered Osiris' body into 26 parts and distributed one to each conspirator to fully enlist them for his future plans. Isis, with the help of Horus, avenged the death of her husband-brother, killed Typhon and the conspirators, and became queen of Egypt. Isis collected all the body parts of Osiris except his childbearing member. She decided to bury each part of him in a secret place in a separate area of the country. For each body part she made a copy of it out of wax. She summoned to her the priests from all over and swore them to say that only with each of them was Osiris' body buried and then to worship him as a god. She ordered them to choose an animal, whatever each wished, and to worship it as a god. The priests carried out everything as Isis had commanded. Each group of priests then claimed that Osiris was buried at their temple. Isis, after Osiris' death, vowed to never allow cohabitation with a man again. For the rest of her life she reigned legally in the highest degree. After she died, she was buried in Memphis and deified. The priests at Thebes relate that the childbearing member of Osiris was thrown into the river by Typhon because none of his fellow priests would take it. And by Isis the member was honored with godlike honors like the other parts of his body. Placing it in the sanctuaries, she commanded that its idol, drawn of wax, should be worshipped supremely in sacraments and sacrifices. This is why the Greeks, who carried over from Egypt the doctrine concerning the holding of orgies at Dionysiac feasts, honored this part of the body in mysteries and sacraments in honor of the god, calling it the phallus. The Egyptians say that many Egyptian colonies then spread over the land. In Babylon the settlers were brought by Bel, the son of Poseidon and Livia. He, having halted at the Euphrates, founded the priesthood, exempt from exactions, as in Egypt, and exempt from all public duties, which the Babylonians called Chaldeans. They observed the stars in imitation of the Egyptian priests, naturalists, and astrologers. It is said that those who fled with Danae founded the most ancient Greek city, Argos. The Colchians of Pontus and the Jews of Arabia and Syria also descended from those who fled with Danae. Hence from antiquity they practiced the custom of circumcising newborn boys, borrowed from Egypt, and the Athenians claimed to be colonists from the Egyptian city of Sais, and adduce the following proof: with them alone of the Greeks the city is called Astiu, which is borrowed from the Egyptian city of Asti. Also the state is divided after the Egyptian model, and is divided into 3 castes. The first, the Eupactrids, very well educated from childhood, and honored like the Egyptian priests. The second caste are the Geomors, who are obliged to bear arms and fight for the country. The last caste being the artisans, executing the most necessary public contracts. Also some Athenian rulers were Egyptians. Osiris built a great city called by the Egyptians as the city of Zeus, Diospolus, and by the Hellenes Thebes. The priests said that from the time of Osiris and Isis to the construction of Alexandria passed 10,000 years, and according to others 23,000 years. The Greeks composed that from Smela, the daughter of Cadmus and Zeus, Osiris was born. Later Orpheus, famous among the Hellenes for his singing, mysteries, and legends of the gods, was most revered in Thebes. He became acquainted with the Egyptian doctrine of the gods, and, to please the Thebans, moved the ancient origin of Osiris to much later times. He established a new doctrine and spread an oral tradition that Dionysus was born of Semele and Zeus. Diodorus of Sicily describes in detail how the ancient Hellenes adjusted and accordingly renamed all the Egyptian gods for their purposes to Greek ones. Diodorus himself quotes from which of his predecessors the chronographers and historians drew their information. He fixed its circumference at 140 stadia, and adorned it sumptuously with great buildings, magnificent temples, and ritual sacrifices. He even ordered the homes of private individuals to be built to 5 stories high. This city was the most splendid, both in Egypt and in the world. Some say that there were not 100 gates in the city, but there were numerous and enormous propiles of the temples, for which reason the city was called Ekatompolis, Stovrout. They say that this city was adorned like no other in the world by innumerable rich offerings of silver and gold, of ivory, of many statues and obelisks. Of the 4 astonishingly beautiful and huge temples, one, the most ancient, had a circumference of 13 stadia, a height of 45 cubits, a thickness of the walls of 24 paces. The buildings are said to have lasted until recently, but the sulfur, gold, precious ivory, and camphor were plundered by the Persians when Cambyses burned the Egyptian temples, 525 BC. The Persians then carried these treasures to Asia, and, bringing the craftsmen from Egypt, built the famous palaces at Persepolis, Susa, and Media. In describing the structure and dignities of the famous Egyptian city of Memphis, Diodorus reminds us too much of Plato's description of Atlantis. The most interesting data for our subject from Diodorus of Sicily are those of Scythia and the related Mesopotamia and Persia. For the establishment of the interrelations and movements of the peoples of Asia in antiquity, and in particular those relating to the Bulgars and their kindred peoples, we should follow his notes. He remarks that he used information from Ctesias of Nid, but it is evident that he used Herodotus' histories. Then, King Ninus of Babylonia led his troops into Armenia and frightened the local population by capturing several cities. King Barzan, who judged himself unable to resist, stepped before the enemy with presents and expressed his submission. For his part, Nin acted magnanimously and left him to lord it over Armenia, only asking him to send him auxiliary troops and provisions for the army. When Nin's works went well, he had a great desire to conquer all of Asia from Tanais to the Nile. For this he made one of his friends satrap of Media, and himself set out on a campaign, subduing the Asiatic tribes, and in the course of 17 years succeeded in becoming master of all the remaining nations, except the Indians and the Bactrians. Separate battles and numbers of all the conquered no writer has described, and the most important of the tribes we shall endeavor to enumerate briefly, following Ctesias of Cnidus. Ninus conquered the maritime and adjacent territories of Egypt and Phoenicia, subdued under his power Troas, Hellespontine Phrygia, Propontis, Bithynia, Cappadocia, and the Pripontian barbarian tribes situated in the districts adjacent to Tanais, conquered the lands of the Cadousians, the Tapers, also the Hyrcani and Draingians, besides them the Derbicans, Carmaninians, and Heromnians, three then the Balkanians and Parthians, passed through Persis, Susiana, and Sea etc. The Caspian, to which a passage too narrow leads, and therefore called the Caspian Gate. He also subdued many other tribes of less importance, of which it is long to speak. Now we pass on to the Scythians, inhabiting the neighboring country of the Indians. At first they occupied an insignificant territory, but at length, having grown a little stronger through their bravery and warlike activity, they conquered a vast territory and brought their tribe great fame and power. In the beginning they lived in small numbers by the Araxes River and were despised for their lack of fame. It was in antiquity, under a warlike and strategically able king, that they took possession of the country from the mountains of the Caucasus to the shores of the ocean and the Maeotian Lake, and the districts on the river Tanais. Subsequently, according to Scythian tradition, there came to them a virgin born of the earth, whose upper part of the body above the waist was female, and the lower like that of a serpent. Zeus, having copulated with her, bore them a son whom he named Scythus, who surpassed in glory all his predecessors, and therefore called his people after his name, Scythians. Among the descendants of this king were two full brothers, one called Palos, the other Nap. After glorious exploits had been performed, they divided the kingdom between them, and after the name of each was his people named, the one Pali, the other Pali. After a few years, the descendants of these kings, distinguished for their valor and strategic thinking, conquered a vast territory beyond the Tanais, as far as Thrace. And, turning their hostilities in the opposite direction, they extended their dominion as far as the Egyptian Nile. Having thus enslaved many of the great tribes living within these limits, they extended the dominion of the Scythians on one side to the Eastern Ocean, and on the other to the Caspian Sea and the Maeotian Lake. Thus this tribe grew very large, and was ruled by glorious kings, after whose names some were called Socers, others Marzads, others Arimaspas, and so on many more. From these kings many other conquered tribes were displaced, and the most considerable of those displaced were, one from Assyria in the country between Paphlagonia and Pontus, and another from Media was settled by the river Tanais. So these nations were called the Sarmaths. These last, after many years, having become very strong, laid waste a considerable part of Scythia, and, by exterminating the vanquished, turned a great part of the country into a desolation. After a time, when Scythia was once in a state of desolation, women distinguished for valor reigned. Among these nations women, like men, are accustomed to war, and in no way inferior to them in courage. For this reason these illustrious women performed many great exploits, not only in Scythia, but in the countries adjacent to it. For example, when the Persian king Cyrus, a mighty dice for his time, with a large army went on campaign against Scythia, the Scythian queen defeated the Persian army on the battlefield, and Cyrus himself was taken prisoner and crucified. The tribe of Amazons thus produced was distinguished by such bravery that it not only ravaged many neighboring countries, but even conquered a considerable part of Europe and Asia. So, in expressing our opinion here about the Amazons, we do not consider it superfluous to tell about them, although our account may seem somewhat incredible and myth-like. At Thermodantus River there was a nation ruled by women who participated in warfare equally with men. It is said that one of them, who held the royal power, was distinguished by her manhood and strength. Having formed an army of women, she trained them in warfare and subdued some of the neighboring nations. As she acquired more and more valor and fame, she constantly attacked the neighboring tribes, and, being elated by her victories, proclaimed herself the daughter of Ars, and left to the men the spinning of wool and the domestic work of women. Then she also issued laws by which she summoned the women to military contests, and forced the men into servitude. Male children had their legs and arms broken to make them unfit for military service, and female children had their right breast burned so that it would not grow into adulthood and thus hinder them. For this reason the tribe of the Amazons was so called. Distinguished for her cleverness and military talent, the queen built a large city at the mouth of the river Thermodont, by the name of Themyscira, and exhaled a marvelous palace. And in time of war she paid the utmost attention to discipline, and for a start subdued all her neighbors to the river Tanais. Having accomplished these feats, she heroically ended her life, fighting brilliantly in one battle. Her daughter, who inherited the kingdom, imitated her mother in valor and in some feats even surpassed her. From a very young age, she was trained to hunt and learned a martial art every day. And she instituted sumptuous sacrifices to Ars and Artemis in the so-called Tauropolis. When she set out on a military campaign across the Ardennes, she conquered all the neighboring tribes as far as Thrace, and returning home with great booty, built magnificent temples to the gods mentioned. By her conscientious rule she aroused to herself the great love of her subjects. She then went to war in the opposite direction, incorporated a large part of Asia, and extended her power as far as Syria. After her death, her kinsman, who succeeded to the royal power, reigned with glory, and raised with power and honor the tribe of the Amazons. After receiving orders to take away the belt of the Amazon Hippolyta, Heracles went on a campaign against the Amazons. Setting sail for Pontus, the so-called Euxine, and having sailed across it to the mouth of the Thermodontus, he encamped near the city of Themyscira, the capital of the Amazons. At first Heracles demanded that the girdle for which he had been sent should be handed over to him, and when the Amazons refused, he engaged them in battle. The detachment of the Amazons commenced a battle with his companions, and the most glorious of them descended upon Heracles himself and engaged him in a fierce skirmish. First to engage Heracles was Aela, so nicknamed for her swiftness, but she was met by a more extreme foe. The second was Philippides, who received a mortal wound at the first contact and died immediately. Then Protoia entered the fray, who is said to have defeated her opponent 7 times in single combat. She, too, was slain, and the fourth Amazon slain by Heracles was named Eurybias, whose prowess in the art of war gave her reason to boast that she needed no one's help, but when confronted by the mightier adversary, her boasts proved false. Chelone was next. Eurybia and Phoebe, Artemis's companions on the hunt, always hurled the spear without error. Now they all failed to hit one target, and fighting side by side, all 3 perished. Heracles then defeated Deianira and Asteria and Marpus, also Tecmessa and Alcippe. The latter had vowed to remain a virgin forever. Her oath she kept, but her life she could not preserve. The leader of the Amazons, Melanippe, who had evoked admiration by her manhood, was deprived of her power, having defeated the most illustrious of the Amazons, and having turned their remaining army to flight, Heracles slew most of them, and so finally defeated that tribe. Of the captured Amazons, he gave Antiope to Theseus, and set Melanippe free after taking away her girdle. While Heracles was occupied with these affairs, the surviving Amazons gathered their forces at the Thermodontus River and resolved to avenge the wrong that Heracles had done them by the campaign. They felt the greatest hatred for the Athenians because Theseus had taken into slavery the leader of the Amazons, called Antiope, or as others write her, Hippolyta. Having allied themselves with the Scythians, the Amazons collected a formidable military force, with which the leader of the Amazons sailed across the Cimmerian Bosporus and crossed into Thrace. Having crossed a considerable part of Europe, the Amazons invaded Attica and encamped at what is now called in their memory Amazonia. On learning of the invasion of the Amazons, Theseus went out against them with the popular host. Along with Theseus was the Amazon Antiope, who had borne him a son, Hippolytus. When the Athenians entered into battle with them, they surpassed them in valor. Theseus' men were victorious, some of the Amazons fell in the fighting, and the rest were driven from Attica. But it so happened that Antiope, fighting with her husband Theseus and distinguishing herself in the battle, fell heroically in it. The surviving Amazons decided not to return to their homeland and went to Scythia with the Scythians and settled with them. When Phineus himself rushed into the battle at the head of many Thracians, Heracles surpassed them all with his skill in battle, killed Phineus himself and quite a number of his warriors, then captured the royal palace, freed Cleopatra from her dungeon, and handed over to Phineus' sons the power belonging to their father. When the youths decided to execute their stepmother, Heracles persuaded them to refrain from severe punishment and to send the woman to Scythia, to her father, and ask he himself shall punish her for the injustice done upon them. And so it was done. The Scythian king condemned his daughter to death, and Cleopatra's sons began to enjoy fame among the Thracians for the mercy they had shown. And in general it happens that ancient myths contain complex and inconsistent stories with one another. Whether it was or not, it is also reported that, handing over the royal power to their mother Cleopatra, the sons of Phineus left with the Argonauts. Having left Thrace and sailed across the Pontus, the Argonauts arrived in Taurus unsuspecting how fierce the inhabitants there were. It was the custom of the barbarians living in that country to sacrifice to Artemis at Tauropolis the foreigners who sailed alongside them. In later times, a priestess of this goddess of theirs was Iphigenia, who sacrificed the captives. Inasmuch as history sets itself the task of explaining the cause of the murders of the foreigners, we shall briefly dwell on them, especially as this retreat has a bearing on the march of the Argonauts. Aelios had two sons, Eets and Perses. Eets became king of Colchis, and Perses of Thrace, both of whom had fierce tempers. Perses had a damsel, Hecate, who surpassed even her father in boldness and wickedness. When she went hunting, in cases of bad luck, she killed people with her bow instead of animals, and being fond of making deadly potions, she invented the so-called aconite poisonous herb and tested the power of each potion by adding it to the food of foreigners. Having gained great experience in these matters, Hecate first killed her father with the potion and inherited the king's power. She then erected a shrine to Artemis, in which she began to offer as sacrifices the foreigners who came to her country, and thus became famous for her cruelty. Hecate then married Eets and bore him two daughters, Circe and Medea, and a son, Aegiapius. Circe took to studying all sorts of potions and sought out all sorts of roots possessing incredible power. Much she learned from her mother Hecate, but considerably more she found through her own diligence, so that no woman could equal her in knowledge of herbal potions. Circe married the king of the Sarmatians, whom some call Scythians, and the first thing she did was to poison her husband. She inherited the royal power and inflicted much cruelty and violence on her subjects. Because of this she lost power, according to some mythographers, and fled to the ocean, where she conquered a desert island and settled there with the women who accompanied her. And, according to the words of some historians, she left Pontus and settled in Italy on a promontory which is still called Circia. As for Medea, they say that she learned from her mother the power of all potions, but used them for quite opposite purposes. She sought to save from danger the strangers who sailed by. Sometimes she persuaded her father by entreaties and caresses to pardon those condemned to death, and sometimes she herself let them out of prison and saw to the safety of the unfortunates. Inasmuch as Medea increasingly resisted her parents' intentions, Aeetes suspected his daughter of disloyalty and placed her under guard. But Medea fled and took refuge in the seaside sanctuary of Aelios. That very night the Argonauts sailed from Thrace to Colchis, straight to that sanctuary. There they met Medea wandering on the shore, and, learning from her the custom of killing foreigners, were convinced of the girl's goodness. They then confided to Medea their purpose, and she told them that they were running a dangerous risk on her father's part for his treatment of foreigners. When it became clear that they might become allies, Medea promised to help the Argonauts until they accomplished their planned feat, and Jason vowed that he would marry Medea and make her his companion forever as long as he lived. Leaving the guards on the ship, the Argonauts set off with Medea for the Golden Fleece. And so it is said that Medea led the Argonauts to the sanctuary of Ars, standing 80 stadia from the city of Sybaris, where the palaces of the kings of the Colchi were erected. As they approached the night-locked gates, she called to the guard in the Taurian dialect. The guard willingly opened the doors to the king's daughter, and the Argonauts rushed in with drawn swords, killed many of the barbarians, and, surprised by the unexpected attack, drove the rest from the sanctuary, took the fleece, and quickly returned to the ship. Medea in their help poisoned with a potion the mythical dragon that guarded the fleece wrapped around him, and together with Jason they hurried to the sea. The Tauri, who had escaped, reported the attack to the king. Eets with his warriors rushed in pursuit of the Hellenes and overtook them at the sea. From the movement he entered the fray and slew one of the Argonauts, Iphitus, the brother of Eurystheus, who had sent Heracles to perform feats, but then, when he had surrounded the other Argonauts with his host of warriors and, pressing them more and more, was slain by Meleager. As soon as the king perished, the Hellenes recovered themselves, the Colchi fled, and many of them perished during their pursuit. In this, Jason and Letes, who had distinguished themselves in the battle, and also Atalanthus and the children of Thespis, were wounded. Medea cured them all in a few days with some roots and herbs, and the Argonauts, after gathering food supplies, set sail. They were in the middle of the Pontus when an unusually fierce storm came upon them. Saying his prayers, as before, to the gods of Samothrace, Orpheus calmed the winds, and then the so-called Glaucus of the sea appeared close to the ship. Accompanying the ship continually for 2 days, he foretold to Heracles his next exploits and immortality, and to the Tindarids that they would receive the nickname of Dioscuri and among all mortals would be honored with divine honors. Then Glaucus sank again into the sea, and the Argonauts, finding themselves near the mouth of the Pontus, descended to the land on which at that time reigned Byzantium, from whom the city took its name of Byzantium. Raising altars and offering prayers of thanksgiving to the gods, they sanctified the place, which is still venerated by sailors passing by. To conclude the story of Theseus' deeds, it remains to tell of the Minotaur he slew. But to make the narrative clear and complete, I must first return to the earlier events connected with this exploit. Tectam, son of Dorus, grandson of Elinus and great-grandson of Deucalion, migrated to Crete at the head of the Aeolians and Pelasgians and became king of the island. He married the daughter of Cretheus, who bore him Asterius. During the reign of the latter in Crete, Zeus, who had abducted Europa in Phoenicia, carried her to Crete on the back of a bull, and having copulated with her, she bore him 3 sons, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Sarpedon. Europa then became the wife of Asterius, the king of Crete, who, being childless, adopted the sons of Zeus, and then handed down to them by inheritance the royal power. Rhadamanthus drew up the laws for the Cretans, and Minos inherited the kingship and married Ithone, the daughter of Lixius, who bore him Lycastus. The latter, having inherited the kingdom, married Ida, the daughter of Corybants, and she bore him Minos II, whom some regard as the son of Zeus. This Minos was the first of the Hellenes to create a powerful fleet and establish dominance at sea. He married Pasiphae, daughter of Aelios and Crito, and she bore him Deucalion, Cathria, Androgeus, and Ariadne. Besides these, Minos had many other children out of wedlock. One of Minos' sons, Androgeus, arrived at the Panathenaic festivities in Athens when Aegeus was king there.